Welcome to the Reliance Insurance Cyber Risk Educational Video. In this 50-minute detailed video, you will learn about the complex landscape of the ever-evolving threat of cybercrime and how you can mitigate risk. We will also break down the rise of ransomware attacks and explain why it is the most common cyber threat Canadians face today, as well as why the role of the insurer has changed significantly in the hard market. This video is brought to you by Reliance Insurance and produced by one of the leading cyber insurers, Coalition. Our presentation will begin with Sophia Kudlyk from Coalition Insurance.
Let's decipher what we're going to really be diving into today. We're going to start off with really just an overall description of where we're at, what's the state of the market, and what's been happening as of late. We're going to go into several of the contributors actually that have sufficiently changed the market as it stands in cyber insurance. So this is going to stem from three different categories. First is the reliance on technology, the sophistication of these bad guys, and how that has changed the role of insurance as it stands. And then we're going to briefly touch upon how Coalition's approach is a little bit different. So, to put it lightly, we are in the midst of experiencing the perfect cyber storm. And we are all, just trying to keep up because the market is really changing on a daily basis. Sometimes terms change from week to week. So it's very difficult to keep your finger on the pulse. But what we're here to do is kind of peel back the layers of the onion to really help our broker partners really understand a little bit more as to how we got here and why this happened. So from what we're going to be tackling today, some of the key contributors from our perspective are, as mentioned, widespread technology risk, and we're going to dive into a little bit more what that is. The increased criminal activity and the overall sophistication of threat actors today, and then the changing role of insurers from responding to actually providing more of a pre-breach service and why that's needed in the marketplace. So in truth, if you were to take any single one of these circles individually, that in itself would have created a shift in the marketplace. However, what's really exacerbating this whole kind of market condition is the simultaneous layering of these variables on top of each other. So what does that really do? It actually amplifies and accelerates all of the market effects that we're seeing in terms of limiting capacity, finding it premiums increasing, claims increasing. So it's a product of all of these things and probably more that we're not mentioning, but we're going to be going through a little bit of detail as to why these things are.
Would you like a free assessment of your security systems using Coalition's state-of-the-art security scan, including recommendations on how you can improve your cybersecurity? Please follow the link below or contact Reliance Insurance Senior Risk Advisor Mark Johnson at mjohnson@reliance.ca or call directly at 604-251-8360.
So, widespread technology risk, right? So we have seen a general overall increased reliance on the way that businesses and we as consumers approach technology. So, how that has changed the overall insurance landscape is because the use of untested technology has actually increased the insecure access points. And in turn, that also increases criminal activity. So the use case of having untested technology, which we're kind of implementing, increased by COVID, right? With the remote workforce. Now we're trying to find every which way to connect remotely. However, not necessarily is this being done in a systematic, proven, tested, and safe way. So no one can deny that the reliance on technology has increased. And new technologies have actually played such a critical role in how we work. They're, fundamental to the way that we communicate over the last 18 months. So with that, the insurability and the role of cyber, being very inherently tied to technology and cyber risk, the role of the insurer has also changed as it pertains to cyber risk transfer, and also the way that we mitigate. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the insurance piece in a little bit, and Kelly's going to take us through that in the presentation. However, what we can agree on is the exposure is increasing. And just like with any growth in risk, there are changes and an evolution overall as to how we approach changing exposure, changing risk, and things like that too. So we wanted to really set the stage by saying we are way more of a target just because of the way we use technology. So in addition to that, we have our increased criminal activity. So increased criminal activity, both in response to widespread technology risks, but it's also the fact that criminals are very easily monetizing their crime. So they're mostly doing that through ransomware and funds transfer fraud. And because these criminals have automated their cyber crime so much, and we see weak security at the parallel end of it, the unpatched systems, they can launch hundreds, thousands of attacks at one time. So now they're taking a spray and pray approach where they're not necessarily targeting one specific target. They're trying to get as many of the low-hanging fruits as possible. So in turn, what do we see from the insurance? The implications from that are carriers and insurance companies are starting to be a little bit more selective about the limited capacity that they have to allocate to certain risks. So, in short, threat actors have always been opportunistic, but they have totally changed their approach ever since COVID and this remote workforce because they know without a doubt in their mind that their approach works. With that shift, not only are they doubling down on their approach, but they're becoming way more confident. You're going to see that in Shelley's portion of the presentation as well, and seeing how these guys are the most confident that their approach works. So the unfortunate reality, and unfortunately, it's even more pervasive for those businesses and companies that don't have a technology focus, is that the offensive tactics of the threat actors and the bad guys really outweigh any defensive strategies that any firm can really employ. So naturally, if you think about it, if you spend all day, every day, developing threat tactics as a bad guy, and you have a growing pool of victims and an unlimited pool of resources from your criminal activity to keep reinvesting in your model, and the victims are not necessarily keeping up with the security trends that are necessary and required to protect themselves, there's going to be a mismatch of forces where the offensive threats really outweigh the defensive strategies. So unfortunately, we're in this position now, right, where we're seeing those changes impact the insurance community. So hopefully I've done a decent description in terms of how the threat actors' tactics really work. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Shelley Ma, who's going to actually first go through the basics as to what some of this mumbo jumbo is in terms of what ransomware is. And then she'll take us through what the different threat actors' methodologies are. So Shelley, over to you.
Thanks, Sophia. Let's go back to the basics. So I'm pretty sure that at this stage of the game, guys, ransomware probably doesn't need too much of an introduction. As a summary, though, I always like to recap that the three characteristics that make something ransomware are, first and foremost, ransomware is a type of malware. And it's designed to encrypt files or encrypt disks, essentially making them completely inaccessible to the user. The encryption by the ransomware is supposed to be reversible, typically by way of contacting the attacker, paying a ransom, and then obtaining the decryption software. The goal of the ransomware actor is to render the entirety of a network, or at least a significant portion of the network, inoperable so that it greatly disrupts business. And the reason it is so widespread, as Sophia alluded to, is that it's a direct and very quick, immediate monetization of the cyber event by the cyber criminal. It's like very quick turnaround. It's very easy to deploy, as you'll see. So of course, it's incredibly popular in this day and age with threat actors. Let's go on to the next slide with the demo. So we've prepared a quick demo of a very simplified version of a ransomware infection event. If you take a look, in this case, the user accidentally downloaded a malicious email attachment that has an embedded ransomware executable, and they inadvertently click on it. And there you go. Right away, you can see that all the files are getting encrypted. An obvious sign is that the ends of the files are appended with this gibberish string. The wallpaper in this case is altered to reflect that an actual ransomware event had taken place. And then a ransom note gets dropped. There's a ransom note. So further down, you'll see that there is an encryption key, and this essentially is it's a unique identifier that attackers use to distinguish the victims. The mode of communication that is specified in the ransom note in this case is the Tor browser, Tor. Tor is what you use to access the dark web, and a lot of attackers now have platforms that they've set up on the dark web. Oftentimes, when threat actors set up a dark web page for a victim to communicate with them, when you access the page, a timer is triggered, and then it will tell you that you only have like X number of days or X number of hours to pay the ransom. And the added time pressure is to strong arm the victim to pay the ransom, of course. So earlier, if you try and open a file, you'll see that the system doesn't recognize the file. It won't know what to do. And all the files are appended with that ransomware extension. So this is what a very generic, very simple run-of-the-mill ransomware infection would look like. Next page. So I've been responding to ransomware since early 2016 and was lucky enough to have been in incident response at the start of ransomware's celebrity status. In those days, ransomware was not really regarded as a particularly serious threat, I would say. As far as attack complexities go, they were pretty unsophisticated. Attackers were known to always target the low-hanging fruits. And so the idea was, as long as you didn't have a low-hanging fruit exposed, or as long as you fixed those low-hanging fruits, you'd be okay. And other types of compromises and breaches were a lot more common than ransomware. We often dealt with attackers that didn't know what they were doing. We often dealt with attackers that were quite amateur in their techniques. And ransomware also left a lot of irreversible file corruption. So it was very nascent at the time, and it was pretty annoying. And even amongst the hacker community, ransomware hackers were usually looked down upon as being technically inept by other hackers and technically the runs of the litter. Back then, the average ransom demands were typically a handful of Bitcoins, equating to a couple $1,000. I first started responding to ransomware in early 2016. And at that time, the ransom demands, like Bitcoins, were relatively new. Nobody really knew too much about it. And the ransom amounts were still pretty low. The very first ransom that I had paid was 1 Bitcoin. And at that time, it was like $300 US. And I recall that because we didn't know how to pay or how to purchase cryptocurrency, we ended up finding a dealer on this random exchange site who only accepted cash. So we had to put the bills in a brown paper bag, met up with this guy on the street corners of like downtown San Francisco. And then after he finished counting the bills, he transferred the Bitcoins to us on his iPad. It was really dodgy. But thankfully, since then, purchasing cryptocurrency has become more conventional, but so has ransomware, of course. The largest ransom amount that I had transacted in 2017 was $50,000. By 2018, it was $300,000. And now it's unfortunately not entirely uncommon to see ransomware in the millions. The largest ransom that I've personally dealt with was 10 million US dollars. But I have seen ransoms as high as 40 million. Next slide. So the rapid escalation of ransom demands is, of course, correlated with the rapid evolution of attack techniques. Along with it are growths in sophistication, maturity, impact, damage. And so if an organization chooses to remain at the IT posture that they were in 2016 or 2017, even as recent as 2020, that is inadequate. And they're essentially sitting ducks waiting for a ransomware incident to happen. In 2016, ransomware was primarily delivered through phishing. The industry then adapted. They got better at accepting attachments with malware embedded directly in them. Antiviruses caught up. By 2017, attackers were mostly using remote desktop protocol, or RDP, to gain direct access to a victim's network. The industry adapted again. They started using VPNs. That's great. But then by 2018, that's when we started to see this stark escalation in techniques that became way more stealthy and way more aggressive by attackers. Today, we're looking at a whole different landscape to what we used to see in a few years ago. And organizations need to accept the change in the landscape to protect themselves adequately. Next slide. To give you a little bit more insight into how ransomware is distributed, and then subsequently the types of attacks that we see. Ransomware is commonly distributed in a pyramid scheme-like setup. It's called RAS, or Ransomware as a Service. So essentially, you have this developer that sits at the top of the pyramid and then distributes the ransomware to the mercenaries down at the bottom of the pyramid. And every successful ransom that is achieved, the developer would get a cut of that payout. It can be as little as like 10%, or it can be as high as 40%. And so in the past, because attackers that we ended up dealing with were likely folks that knew very little about the actual malware itself, because they just bought the package online, bought it on the dark web, we ended up dealing with a lot of amateurs, and that used to be very common. And you'll see in the next slide. Case in point, this is an attacker from 2016. This is over Gmail. That's a lot of attackers would prefer to use email back then versus now, where we primarily communicate over the dark web. But this attacker, he had no idea what was going on. He communicated to us, "Dude, stop crying. I can explain again. I am not the author. Did not know that the software would be like this." And if you look at the next one, that is another attacker from 2016 who let us know that he used up all the ransom money to buy apparently a tablet, Tommy Hilfiger, steaks, and alcohol. And apparently he's typing this to us while he's inebriated. As you can see from the last line, I am a little drunk, LOL. So this used to be the caliber of attackers that we saw. Perhaps it wasn't too threatening. Perhaps we didn't need to sound the alarm bells.
Would you like a free assessment of your security systems using Coalition's state-of-the-art security scan, including recommendations on how you can improve your cybersecurity? Please follow the link below or contact Reliance Insurance Senior Risk Advisor Mark Johnson at mjohnson@reliance.ca or call directly at 604-251-8360.
But let's look at the landscape today. From 2020 to 2021, we saw a marked 47% increase in the severity of ransomware. And tying this to a broader statistic from 2019 to 2020, we actually saw a 153% increase in severity of ransomware attacks. We believe that this was likely due to COVID, due to the changes in security and structure, and all being very, very much tested due to the remote working situation. As I said, attackers are becoming increasingly aggressive. They're putting in a lot more effort into their attacks, and there's definitely costs associated with that. It is now pretty rare for us to see a ransom demand in the 5 figures. In fact, when we do encounter like a $50,000 ransom, we high five each other because we lucked out. Paying the ransom is always the last option. Next slide. On the right, you can see screenshots from the web pages that are set up by ransomware groups today. And as you can see, it's a whole different era of sophistication versus the email communications I just showed you. There's a background page, there's an instruction page, even a chat window with an avatar. The caliber of threat actors that we deal with today are highly professional, often with round-the-clock operations and advanced interfaces. They're stealthy. Their attack vectors are very difficult to detect. They hide behind layers and layers of obfuscation. Attackers are also interconnected. They're collaborative. They are different functions of different groups of hackers who collaborate with one another in their ecosystem to create this well-oiled assembly line. You have those actors that just harvest credentials, and then they also identify access points into victim environments. Those are called intermediary access brokers, IABs. IABs would then sell those accesses to ransomware actors who deal with encryption and the ransom, of course. And then the data that's stolen by ransomware actors from within the network can then be sold further to data miners. So as you can see, there's a lot of like interconnected threat activity. Ransomware today is also highly destructive, much more so than before, not only on the technical front, but also to business operations, business interruptions, as well as reputationally. It causes a lot of damage. And as we touched on prior, ransoms are now very exorbitant, to say the least, but also in the equation are costs that's associated with business interruption, recovery fees, forensics, lawyers, and notification costs. Next slide. There is a common misconception that ransomware is fully automated. And as long as you counter the effects of the encryption itself, as long as you have contingency for your files, then you're golden. So as long as you have backups, you're golden. And this is simply not true in today's world. In the vast majority of ransomware cases, upwards of 98%, anecdotally speaking, the threat actor has remote access to the victim network. That means that they have access to your files, folders, databases, pictures, emails, everything. So whatever that is, whatever data is valuable and accessible, such as PII, financial information, healthcare information, account credentials, they can be taken by the actors. Another misconception is that ransomware attacks are quick and isolated, and that is also not true in a lot of cases. Oftentimes, we see the stealthy attacker in the environment for months or sometimes up to a year in advance of the ransomware execution. They're hijacking the victim's servers to mine cryptocurrency. They're using the systems to hack other victims. They're running scam campaigns, so on and so forth. Next slide. So recently, there was a threat intelligence white paper that was published by an Intel group that presented research on industries and companies that were primarily targeted by ransomware groups. They found that there were specific parameters or characteristics of their victims that ransomware actors tended to target, tended to navigate towards, particularly with respect to geography and revenue. In general, what they found was, so what they did firstly is they did research on marketplace across 50 different marketplaces on the dark web where ransomware actors would post wanted ads. And they found that with respect to geography, ransomware gangs prefer victims to be located in USA, Canada, Australia, and Europe. According to the research, the average minimum revenue that's desired by ransomware gangs is $100 million or more. However, this can be different depending on the geographic location of the victim, and small companies are targeted as well. They're definitely not exempt. For example, one of the very prominent groups, Black Matter Ransomware, they are looking for targets specifically in the USA, Canada, Australia, and Great Britain with revenue of $100 million or more. And that's their wanted ad on the left side of the screen. There's also something that ransomware actors like to limit by, and that's called blocklist of sectors. So they found that some ransomware actors avoided healthcare and others were less picky about other industries of the companies that they encrypted. So they found 47% of ransomware attackers refused to buy access to companies from the healthcare and education industries. 37% prohibited compromising the government sector, and 26% claimed that they would not purchase access related to nonprofit organizations. So the reasons why, they found that actors who did not want to attack healthcare or nonprofits, it was generally due to the moral code of the attackers. And yes, apparently hackers do have moral codes. Surprising. Although, we do have a Black Matter case that's ongoing right now where our insured is a pharmacy. And when we questioned them, hey, we thought you didn't attack healthcare, they were like, oh, but you're not a hospital. No one's dying. So you're not exempt from this ransom. So you take their word with a giant grain of salt. When it comes to the education sector, and that's off the table, the reason is usually the same, or the fact that education victims simply cannot afford very large ransoms. And then actors who refuse to target government sectors is mainly a precautionary measure where they want to avoid unwanted attention from law enforcement, which kind of makes sense. Next slide, please.
Sure thing, Shelley. And thank you for that. I just wanted to briefly interrupt and pick your brain a little bit as we're getting a lot of great questions here. And one of those questions is, can you explain why backups may not be enough? And I know that, every insurer uses the payment of the ransom as a last resort, backups being one of the first things that we look at from an incident response side. So can you explain why sometimes backup strategies are ineffective and why companies are forced to pay the ransom, and especially offsite backups? If you can also touch on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Backups are absolutely pivotal, absolutely critical. So please do not interpret my messaging as like, oh, you don't need backups. So backups were basically the ultimate saving grace back in the day when we were purely dealing with encryption events. When encryption is the only thing you have to worry about, and the only leverage that the threat actors have is prohibiting your access to your own data. If you have backups, then essentially you can get yourself up and running. There were, however, and still is today, a lot of issues with backups, even though a company or an organization may have backups and they check the box of having backups. There are so many subtle nuances to the backups that often are overlooked that come into play and have a great impact in incident response. Namely, a lot of folks or a lot of organizations tend to not have entire coverage of their data with backups. So perhaps only a portion of their critical data is backed up, or perhaps it's backed up quite infrequently. So sometimes the organization may have backups, but it goes back 2 months or goes back 3 months, and is simply not enough, not adequate enough to resume business operations immediately. Other times you run into the issue of there being not being enough experience knowing how to restore from backups. And so perhaps, it's a situation of it's going to take us just 2 weeks to figure out how to actually roll back to backups. And it would actually be faster to pay for a ransom. So things like that are the more subtle nuances of of backups. There are also concerns with how things are backed up. So we often recommend like having multiple tiers of backups, one being online and connected, another being in the cloud, another being completely offsite and tape backups. So usually with some combination of these, they would be enough for data contingency. Offsite backups are absolutely critical and definitely needed in today's landscape, because one of the first things ransomware actors do when they get into an environment is move laterally to backup locations, delete them, or encrypt them. So having offsite backups is definitely critical. But since 2019, I was actually going to touch on this today on this slide, excuse me. Since 2019, there's been a dramatic shift in the approaches of ransomware actors, where rather than focusing purely on encryption, they now focus on encryption as well as data theft. And when they have your data, in their possession, and then they have the ability to essentially expose that data that could be incredibly sensitive or incredibly private, that is another way that they can leverage your and strong arm you to pay the ransom. So we call that doxing, which is like, if you choose not to pay the ransom, they will publicly release your private information. And sometimes, if we're dealing with healthcare entities or dealing with particularly sensitive data, that may be justification to also pay a ransom, even though you may have data contingency with backups. So, Sophia, I don't know if that covers the question.
Definitely does. Thank you so much. We have a lot more good questions coming in, but I'm going to keep those to the end to not interrupt too much. So please keep going.
Oh, perfect. I won't be much longer. I had briefly already touched on the topic of data theft earlier, but I think the element of exfiltration deserves its own special spotlight. Data exfiltration and the subsequent extortion is a huge problem. So about 5 years ago, as I said, a ransomware incident rarely equated with an actual data breach because it was solely an encryption event and not a data theft event. But as I mentioned, nowadays, if they have access to the private information of all your employees and customers and threaten to leak them on the public internet, that goes into the equation of should we pay or should we not. On the left, you can actually see a screenshot of what a ransomware actor's leak site looks like. Just take a look. It's super well categorized. It's organized. It's publicly accessible. I mean, it looks better than some of the websites that I see out there today that are legitimate. And it's super easy to download this data. You literally just push download, and it gives you even a time frame of when the data should be expected to be published should this victim choose not to pay. The implications are very significant because regardless of whether the ransomware actors post the exfiltrated data or not, the bottom line is that data still did go out the door, which of course has legal ramifications. If there are any lawyers on the line, they can tell you that we have to exhaust a multitude of forensic avenues to extrapolate the full population of data that was taken. And sometimes that's not even doable. And as a last resort, we may even have to hunt the dark web to try and find access to the stolen credentials. Next slide. Oh, this is my favorite slide. So ransomware operations are now so well run today that they even have representatives who call you on a phone. And this is a recording of one of CIR's cases, which Sophia will play shortly. Feel free to follow along the transcript.
So I will not call you actually anymore. It's just the first and last time.
Okay. I don't understand. I don't understand how I go onto a chat.
I can guide you now. You need a pen and a paper to write down how to do that. When you will double click this file, it will open in that Tor browser as a chat window. And that is the chat where you will communicate with my mates. You can type anything there like hello or something, anything you want, and you will get a reply very fast. And since then, negotiations will be started. We're not going to take a huge amount from you. We're not going to publish your data until we have successful negotiations. We will provide you samples what we have. We will provide you a sample of decryptor so you can be sure that it works. We are not from your competitors or from authorities. No. And we will not tell anybody in the world about this leak. So it will be confidential between you and us. Negotiate with us and you will get your business back fast.
You can't tell me that anyone wants to receive a phone call like that. Responding to ransomware incidents, negotiations, and communications are very delicate, and they do require expertise to handle as effectively, as cheaply, and as timely as possible. So I hope I was able to do justice in painting accurately and transparently the intensity of the risks that we're encountering in today's landscape. I cannot emphasize enough the criticality for organizations, regardless of their size and industry, to be equipped with cyber insurance. As the landscape evolves, attackers are adapting along with it, and the industry is playing constant catch up. Cyber insurance also needs to adapt and evolve and stay present and relevant. So with that being said, I'm excited to turn this over to Kelly, who will be speaking more to the changing role of insurers.
Thanks so much, Shelley. I don't think you'll find anybody in the industry, at least from my side of the table, that's more passionate about ransomware than Shelley Ma. So that definitely sets us up nicely and paints a very good picture as to how we got to where we are today in the hard market that we're dealing with at the moment in cyber. So when I first started in cyber insurance all of 5 years ago, I think, cyber was not deemed a very important exposure at the time. Companies that did take it out were more concerned with privacy liability and having large lawsuits and fines from the privacy commissioner versus the stark difference that we see at the moment where there's a massive wave of ransomware claims. And as a result of that, a huge pivot in the market and has led us to this point in terms of the hardening market that we're in at the moment. So what we're dealing with right now is cyber losses have increased in both frequency and severity. There's a massive constraint in the market at the moment due to high loss ratio. So across all insurance carriers, it can be as low as 52% all the way up to 548%. Is the figures that I found while doing a bit of research in the industry at the moment, which is significantly high. Not only that, carriers who actually provide cyber insurance have themselves been hit with ransomware. In the last couple of years, we've seen very large carriers who themselves have been hit with ransomware attacks and has led to significant business interruption claims and losses. So with what Shelley was discussing and ransomware claims skyrocketing, insurers are pulling back in terms of coverages, be it crime coverage, even reducing limits from full limits of 10 mil to 5 million. And also we've seen extortion limits and ransomware limits decrease to being sublimited completely to 250,000. So very, stark difference compared to a couple of years ago, where full limits for ransomware certainly were not considered a big deal. Moreover, we're seeing like average premium renewal increases of about 80% in the industry right now as a whole. That's if you're lucky enough to actually get a renewal quote at the moment. There's also been a dramatic change in appetite to mitigate losses. So where we, I suppose, as underwriters used to consider target classes as professional services and even managed service providers 3 or 4 years ago, there's been a dramatic shift in the sense that they're now the highest target that we see in the industry for ransomware attacks. So not many carriers in this market, at least, would consider quoting them or consider them within appetite at this time. So, Sophia, if you wouldn't mind just jumping to the next slide, please.
Would you like a free assessment of your security systems using Coalition's state-of-the-art security scan, including recommendations on how you can improve your cybersecurity? Please follow the link below or contact Reliance Insurance Senior Risk Advisor Mark Johnson at mjohnson@reliance.ca or call directly at 604-251-8360.
There's pros and cons to a hard market. Arguably, carriers in the last 5 years were giving away too much coverage for too little premium for too long. And there's been a dramatic shift in the sense that now we're restricting coverages, we're seeing limits being dropped and things of that nature that I touched on earlier. But it also means that clients have to look internally at their own security posture to ensure that they remain insurable. So with the hardening market, it does force clients to take a look internally at what they have, where in the soft market, as an underwriter, we would have considered mandatory security controls as antivirus, firewalls and things of that nature, versus in the hard market, we're looking, to Shelley's point earlier, to have multi-factor authentication on things like remote access, privileged accounts and emails, segmented backups, and testing backups to full restoration. So there's definitely been a dramatic change, and with that, the clients are expected to keep up with that pace in the joined fight against the bad actors in the industry right now. And COVID, with that, in the last 2 years, has certainly forced us into more of a virtual world, where companies who used to operate on a brick and mortar basis essentially were forced into getting involved in more of the cyberspace, and thus had an exposure where they previously may not have. And as well as that, so larger ransomware claims are also being broadcast by the media. So clients are starting to realize that their exposure certainly exists where they may not have seen before. Colonial Pipeline being top of mind, Kaseya and things of that nature. And then moving to the next slide. So the role of the insurer has changed alongside all of this as well, where when we used to underwrite maybe 5 years ago and look over 18-page manual submissions by way of checking to see what boxes are ticked on an application, we've moved also more into the world where insurtechs such as Coalition, for example, are partnering more so with clients to determine what the exposure is and help to mitigate it prior to offering coverage. So the role of the insurer has changed significantly in the hard market, where there used to just be a panic button that they used to provide in the event of a claim. We're now seeing pre-breach scanning and updates and post-breach remediations. Coalition, for example, when the Microsoft Exchange vulnerability came out initially, was able to identify that and flag that with clients so that they could update their systems immediately and cause as little downtime as possible. So the archaic method that we used to have for underwriting has certainly shifted dramatically in the last year because of COVID and the high loss ratios and the wave of ransomware that Shelley touched on earlier. And with that, we can move on to the next slide, Soph. Thank you. So further to my point about cyber insurance industry incentivizing better security to ensure that the clients remain insurable, we're now collectively in an odd transitionary phase of the overall industry evolution, where brokers are tasked with finding coverage where gaps in insurer underwriting mandates exist. So, for example, the implementation of multi-factor authentication. However, it's only a matter of time before these common security exploits become widely accepted as mandatory in providing coverage at all. So there's definitely been a wave of improving the mandatory security controls across all carriers, which sees the likes of multi-factor authentication, EDR, and things of that nature as a minimum security control prior to offering any coverage. And certainly, I think that will help with the wave of the ransomware claims that we're seeing at the moment in the industry. And yeah, thanks, Sophia. So yeah, just my last point then, in terms of how underwriting has changed, we've definitely had to take a dramatic shift in order to keep up with the bad actors. And from a coalition perspective, at least, and being an insurtech, we're able to take a very nuanced approach in the sense that we can actually scan the public-facing networks of any potential client and assess what a bad actor can see from the other side, and with that, help them remediate their immediate exposures prior to actually offering quote, which is something that I think is very necessary in the market right now, and something that I think clients were asking for quite some time. So it's nice to actually be able to provide it, especially in the market that we're in. And with that, I'll thank you for your time and pass it over to my colleague, Sophia, to carry on the presentation.
Amazing. Thank you, Kelly and Shelley. So I hope that we haven't scared everyone too much off their seats with all of this information. But I think what we want to really convey in this kind of overview of what the landscape looks like right now is that I know a lot of questions come in from clients, mentioning that we're not an active target for the threat actors. What could they possibly want with our information? And, using that analogy previously in terms of the way that we underwrite as an adversary at Coalition, we know that most threat actors don't specifically target certain industries. Let's remember that these threat actors are opportunistic, they're non-discriminatory, and pretty much largely lazy. So what they look at is the ease of ransom payments in that payout. So they're obviously looking for the easiest target more often than chasing after some specific target that has the defenses and controls. That's a different type of attack, which isn't as common. So we're starting to see, this tactic that's shifting, unfortunately, to the small to mid-sized business space, where those unfortunate companies that don't have the level of security or controls, those industries are a little bit more vulnerable in those sizes of businesses. And threat actors know that. They know which industries rely on their sensitive data a little bit more or on critical operations. And unfortunately, what ends up happening is that those companies who are victimized by ransomware are more likely to do whatever it takes to recover. So that idea is exactly what threat actors extort. And we hope that this is something that you can take away when speaking to clients, because knowing how reliant the end user is on their sensitive information or their critical operations, that is exactly what the threat actors are banking on. So I know Kelly mentioned, the way that Coalition explores cyber risk. And when we underwrite an account, we tend to take our threat actor goggles and really put them on, and we evaluate exactly the external facing environment that any bad guy would see when scavenging the dark web or looking for open remote desktop protocol, right? So we're really taking the same viewpoint. and approaching it from more of a technologically holistic perspective. And with that, we're better able to mitigate, some of the frequency and severity of the losses that are hitting the industry quite so heavily right now. And, the big hope and dream is that we help clients preemptively improve their cyber posture by sending, red flags or something that we had noticed in our non-invasive technical scan. So essentially what that does is we try to help clients prevent them from being that low-hanging fruit that is so easily exploitable to the threat actors. So that's sort of the methodology behind it all. We also often provide continuous monitoring and support, and I don't think that there's anyone better able to talk to that than Shelley, who can discuss a little bit more as to how that works on the back end.
Yeah, so thanks, Soph. One of the ways that we help our cyber policyholders prior to any incidents is by providing ongoing monitoring, ongoing support. These are external scans that we're doing. Basically the same exact view that an adversary would be seeing should they have scanned our policyholders. And then we look for vulnerabilities and we notify the insured and their IT team of any exposed vulnerability, any type of exposure that they can proactively remediate so that they can mitigate this type of threat before it is noticed and exploited by an adversary. I know that a lot of folks seem to be having some quality issues with the presentation, so apologies for that. But if you are able to see, this is a screenshot of what's displayed on our threat risk assessment report, which would very clearly display what the exposures look like, what the vulnerabilities look like, and what is going to be needed to fix some of these issues.
Awesome. Thanks, Shelley. That's a great overview. And I think that, the way that we're going to conclude our presentation is just to really showcase, does this approach actually work? Does, taking that threat actor perspective and doing the continuous monitoring, does it actually work? And actually, what we'll find is that coalition policyholders actually experience fewer claims. And again, Shelley, you have seen all of the claims that have come through. So wondering if you can elaborate here.
Definitely. So coalition's policyholders do consistently experience fewer claims than the overall market. The NAIC statistic at the top, I'm going to have to read this out to you. National Association of Insurance Commissioners, NAIC, provides expertise, data, and analysis for insurance commissioners to effectively regulate the industry and protect consumers. I don't have too much of an insurance knowledge, so apologies for the Wikipedia translation there. But in large part, the reason why our policyholders have fewer claims is due to the unique approach to underwriting, the proactive scans by the security team, and the coalition feedback loop, where new indicators of compromise and vulnerabilities that we see on the post-breach side is then used to inform underwriting. We have a few different types of offerings. The one that folks are most familiar with would be incident response, which is where we're engaged after a breach or compromise has occurred, and we assist the policyholder in stopping the bleeding and investigating what happened. We also have security office hours at Coalition, where insureds or applicants can schedule a time to chat with our security personnel on cyber-related topics. So if you're experiencing some sort of technical issue, or you simply have some inquiries or questions that you want to run by, then we have security personnel on staff who would be able to assist with that and offer next steps. And finally, our newest offering is what we call malware signal alerts, which has already seen quite a bit of success in preventing pretty big losses. Part of the external efforts is monitoring attacker traffic, attacker infrastructure, and domains. And sometimes we receive external indications that we call signals that may allude to an active malware infection within our policyholders' networks. And should we positively identify one of these malicious signals, we would notify our policyholders and advise them on containment and next steps and whether investigation is necessary. And using this very proactive methodology, we've been able to stop huge ransomware losses just before they were about to flip the switch. I think we can probably move on to the next slide, Sophia.
Yeah, absolutely. And Shelley, I think that you did a really good job with illustrating like how our scanning kind of works as well. And I wonder if I could insert a question here from our audience. Based on the threat assessment report, when we do receive some of those flags, will Coalition be willing to review after the client has addressed and remedied some of the things that they have failed on? So typically, and I'll go and answer this question first, and then Kelly and Shelley, please chime in. But typically, the answer to that question is yes. We typically have a window of failure to see how, if that implementation has been made by the client. We typically wait 60 days before we reevaluate. That buffer of time really just ensures that no one was in that system within that 60 days, just waiting to execute an exploit. So yes, the answer to your question is we will take a look at an account, and the whole kind of goal is to have that information sharing and that dialogue with clients to ensure that they're raising their minimum baseline security standard in order to become less of a risk to those threat actors. So hopefully that answered the question. Shelley and Kelly, have I missed anything there?
No, great job, Soph. Yeah, that's perfect.
Well, thank you. So, in conclusion, we hope that everyone who joined us today really has added some verbiage to their toolkit to help explain the changing landscape, threat actor methodologies, and the way they think, the way they operate, and ultimately what cyber insurance really is at the end of the day. So, whether it's widespread change in the way that we rely on technology, or the increased sophistication of threat actors and the way that they target victims, ultimately we see that the insurance landscape is changing, and we're here to help answer any of those questions and help your clients as well too.
Thank you for watching the Cyber Risk Education video brought to you by Reliance Insurance and Coalition. We hope you have a better understanding of the complex landscape surrounding cybercrime today. Would you like a free assessment of your security systems using Coalition's state-of-the-art security scan, including recommendations on how you can improve your cybersecurity? Please follow the link below or contact Reliance Insurance Senior Risk Advisor Mark Johnson at mjohnson@reliance.ca or call directly at 604-251-8360.